Welcome to Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda. Growing up in the north of Scotland during the 19th century, Mary Slessor did not look like somebody whose life was likely to change even her family's life, let alone a nation's life. She did not look like somebody who could ever make a great impact for God or for anything else. Her father was an alcoholic and ended up losing his job and taking a very lowly paid job in a textile mill. And Mary herself, by the time she was 14 years old, she had ended her education and she was working 12 hours a day in that same textile mill. But she was a committed Christian in her local Presbyterian church, and she got involved in Sunday school, and she was greatly involved in reaching out to the streets round about where she lived, sharing Jesus with children and teenagers and bringing them along to the Sunday school in the church. And so Mary Slessor did end up making an impact on other people's lives. Now, if that was all this story had, if that was where it ended, you know what, that would still be a case of somebody confounding expectations and going beyond what others had expected of them. Mary, who looked like she would not impact anybody's life, was impacting a lot of people's lives in the area where she was brought up. But then she was inspired to go to Africa. There was a missionary at the time, a British missionary called David Livingstone. And David Livingstone, he was an explorer, he was a missionary, he was a campaigner against the slave trade and had a very high profile. Eventually, he did die quite young in Africa, and his body was brought back to Britain, but his heart was buried under a tree. He wanted his heart to be buried in Africa because he said, "I gave my heart to Africa long ago." And today you can still go and visit and see that spot where his heart was buried beside a tree. But anyway, his body was brought back home. He had a state funeral. He was buried in Westminster Abbey. But that made a great impact upon Mary Slessor, and she determined that she was going to go to Africa as a missionary as well. Now, again, this was somebody who looked like they could never make a great impact for God, but had managed to impact the area in which she lived and some of the young people there. But to go from that to being a missionary to Africa in the 19th century was a huge step. She went to Calabar in Nigeria. Now, I've been to Calabar, the Garden City in Nigeria, and today it's a beautiful city. It's of all the cities I've been to in Nigeria, I would say it's the cleanest, it's the best laid out, it's the most beautiful. There's some fine buildings in it, but it wasn't great back in the 19th century. And Mary Slessor went there and labored as a ministry. She fought against certain things that were happening there. At that time, infanticide was still taking place. People, particularly twins, there was superstitions that twins were bad luck. And so when you had a twin, often the youngest twin would be killed. And Mary fought against that practice, and she ended up adopting a number of children, including twins that would otherwise have been neglected or abandoned, and she adopted them as her own children. She fought for women's rights in Nigeria as well. She was active in bringing people to Christ. She was also very active in fighting against diseases and trying to improve people's lives in so many ways. She traveled all around the country, helping with campaigns to vaccinate, for example, people against smallpox, a disease that was having a dreadful effect on people in Nigeria at the time. Now, Mary Slessor basically just wore herself out serving Jesus in Africa. Her health declined. She suffered from malaria for most of the time that she was in Africa. It was very debilitating. And she died in 1915. And she was actually given a state funeral in Nigeria. This woman, born in poverty in the north of Scotland, looked like she was going to spend her whole life there, and yet she managed to impact people's lives in Scotland and then went to Africa and impact thousands and thousands of lives in Africa. Why? Because God takes ordinary people and does extraordinary things through them. Thank you for joining us for this Take 5. Join us again next time for another Take 5, your 5-minute inspirational message from Solid Rock Drogheda.